Welcome to my kitchen. Today's recipe is the side dish for our retro week meal prep. Barley and mushroom. This dish goes perfectly with the pork chops. It adds a nice warmth and coziness to the meal. It's very hearty, and it even makes a great meal by itself. Of course, we're starting with onions, but not a lot. Now, if you'll notice, my onion has a bad spot in it. So we're just going to remove that part and use what we need. If you can, try to have extra on hand. There's nothing worse than not having enough to complete your recipe. Okay, it's not the end of the world, but it's a good habit to have a little bit extra in case something like this happens. Produce can be tricky. You never know what it's going to look like inside. I start the pan out on high heat and then turn it down to a medium high. While we're waiting for the oil in the pan to heat up, we can go ahead and get the garlic started. I'm not using a lot of garlic, just a little bit. I just want to add a little bit of depth to the dish. When you add similar ingredients to a dish, it makes the flavors more complex. Onions, garlics, scallions, shallots, they're all similar ingredients and will change the flavor depending on the combination that you use and how much you use of each ingredient. It can be a subtle difference, but that's what makes things more complex. Once you've been cooking for a while, you'll learn the differences of the ingredients and you'll learn how to change your flavor profile a little bit. That's why I use sweet onions instead of yellow onions. Yellow onions have a stronger flavor, and I like the sweet onions better. Garlic also has a strong flavor, and so do scallions. That's why scallions are a great garnish. The same principle works for all your spices and anything else you would add to your basic flavors. This is what makes cooking so much fun to me. There's so many ways to fix the same ingredients and get a different dish in the end. Once you choose your basic flavors, you can make something as plain or as complex as you want. That's why you can have chicken and tomatoes, and the dish can become an Italian dish, a Greek dish, a Spanish dish, or even Jamaican dish. Different spice combinations are what makes the difference from one region to another. Once we get the onions in the pan, we can get started on the mushrooms. For the most part, mushrooms are usually clean, but you'll want to give them the once-over and brush off any dirt that might be on them. If they're really dirty, you can run them under some water, but you'll want to dry them off right away. Mushrooms have a lot of water in them, and they absorb more if they are wet for too long. Now, I like the flavor of mushrooms more than I like the texture, so I'm cutting them up into small pieces. I think that in this dish, having everything the same size gives it a nicer texture. If you want bigger pieces of mushroom, by all means, go ahead, but it will change the texture of the dish. You want to cook the mushrooms a bit before we start to add the seasonings. We want just a bit of color on the mushrooms. By browning the mushrooms and onions, it helps intensify the flavors. After the water is cooked off the mushrooms, you can go ahead and add your seasonings. The garlic, salt, pepper, all go in and give it a good stir. Once the seasonings are in, you're going to want to cook them just a little bit longer, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. Okay, for the barley. Barley is a grain, and it cooks very much just like rice. There are 2 different kinds of barley. It's called hulled or pearled. This is the difference of how it's processed. It does take a little longer to cook the hulled barley, and it does require a little bit more liquid. Pearled barley cooks the same as rice, 20-25 minutes. The hulled takes a little bit longer, closer to 40 minutes. The ratio is 3 cups of liquid to 1 cup of barley. I also like to cook it a little bit slower on a very low simmer. If you prefer it softer and not as chewy, then you can cook it for a longer time, but you will want to add some extra liquid. Now, to add some extra flavor and some richness, I decided that I would use beef stock to cook the barley. If you wanted this to be a vegetarian dish, you could use vegetable stock or even just plain water. You could serve it as a side dish with some vegetables or some tofu, and it would make a great vegetarian meal. So, add the stocks to the pot, add a small amount of salt, and the barley goes in. Then we're going to put the mushrooms and the onions in, and give it a good stir and put the lid on it and bring it to a boil. Once it's got to a boil, you can turn it down to a low simmer. Just like when I cook rice, I added some salt. I'm not going to add a lot of salt because there's salt in the beef stock and we added salt to the mushrooms and the onions. While the barley's cooking, we can go ahead and get the rest of the ingredients set up. I put some wax paper down on the counter to grate the cheese on. It just makes things a little bit easier. So I'm going to use a rasp for this cheese. This is a harder cheese, and when you use the rasp, you get nice little thin, tiny pieces, and it just melts so much better. Then I can also use the rasp for the lemon zest. I used all of the lemon zest, the whole lemon. The zest and the juice are what give this barley a nice, bright, fresh flavor. Then we can chop up some parsley. And you can use the curly or Italian parsley. Doesn't matter. This will add a nice freshness. I almost forgot to add the thyme to the barley. Once the barley's done cooking, we can remove it from the heat and add our cheese, lemon, and parsley. Once everything is stirred up really well, here's where you're going to want to taste it, and if you wanted to add a little bit more salt, you could. I like to store my food in glass containers. I just find that it's easier to see what's in the container, and the containers are so much easier to clean. This dish went so well with the pork chops and apples. A cup of the barley has 185 calories and 8 grams of protein. I used about 2/3 of a cup for the dinner, and that was more than enough. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy this recipe, and I hope you give it a try. Let me know if you have any questions.